failure. Let's take them one at a time, and we continue from there.
Yeah, Sebastian, that sounds great. Do you have the slide, or do you need me
I do.
to pull
Let
that?
me
Awesome.
put it up.
Yeah, so you know, in April, um, started getting calls from a number of folks that Monterey were the first calls we started finding these for me, and it has this phenomenon where the trees bloomed normally and even had good set, but you didn't have the buds push, the vegetative buds push. And in some cases, like in this upper left photo, they just leafed out late. In other cases, the bud was still dormant, and then in other situations, there just was no bud there anymore for some reason. So in the bottom left-hand photo, you see a block of this row is 50% Monterey and 50% nonpareil, and you see the Monterey tree, the closest tree, and the third tree, and then the nonpareil in between. And then Phoebe Gordon also had this photo of Bennett Hickman, a second leaf Bennett Hickman down in her area. I believe this was in Merced. So um, we don't know if the Bennett Hickman issue that we saw this year is a phenomenon. But your first question, Sebastian, was what is it? And I think that we have a better idea of what it isn't versus necessarily what it is. So we know that it's a that what it's not is non-infectious bud failure, like we see in Carmel. It's not this chronic genetic disorder, but it is something that we've seen before. Looking back through the farm advisor communications over the years, it's been something that was reported well before 2000, and then periodically since then, every few years there'll be a report of some issue in a Monterey block or in Padre, but either it's not an issue the next year, so it hasn't been very top of mind for farm advisors or the research community. But there are at least a couple of blocks in Tehama County that have Monterey that have had this problem every year, and the trees look really bad after a couple years. But following a year where yields were just excellent across the board, those growers, started the year thinking, "Ooh, I think I'm going to have to pull my Monterey's," but definitely a yield impact. But I think they're holding on to their Monterey's for now after getting such good yields despite the problem.
Wow, very interesting. Look, so you say it's not bud failure then. It's not bud failure, infection, bud failure. So how do we? I mean, to me, the picture looked really similar to that. So how do we know if that is not that? What is there any difference that we could observe?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sebastian. So we know it's not bud failure because bud failure is very much this genetic phenomenon that can be tied from the tree back all the way to the origin of the genetics, and could be different between nurseries and things like that versus and it's a problem that is just going to get worse and worse. There's no recovery versus there seems to be some recovery in this situation, at least in many cases. There's certainly. I was just on the phone this week with a grower who has young Hickman in the Durham area, and he just had two trees out of his whole block that had this type of look that Phoebe Gordon is showing here. And he said by the end of the year, he wouldn't be able to, he'd be able to show you those trees, but a passerby wouldn't know which trees those were.
Okay.
So there's just tons of variability in this leafing failure problem. It might just be a trees like that situation, or it might be just about every Monterey in the block. And the variability within the orchard, within the canopy, how it may only be one scaffold, and then between orchards is just tremendous. So we have way more questions than answers at this point. But one of your questions was about the spread across the valley, and I certainly didn't hear reports of this, at least in Monterey, really south of Mae's area in Fresno. So I'm interested in why we didn't, hear reports of it in the southern San Joaquin. If folks, uh, did have this issue that are on the call, I would be interested to hear about it at the end of the program. That'd be fun.
Yeah. So, okay, so it really looked like it's one of those situations that happen early in the season and it's very scary. And then the trees seem to catch up a little bit. That's kind of like your sense. And in some occasions, it may last for multiple years. And are you actually following or planning to follow this in more detail for the next season or so?
Yeah, I'm trying to do, not do what we've done as farm advisors in the past and just, if it's not a widely reported issue next year, just kind of forget about it until it's an issue again. I have a few blocks that I'm following and tracking to see how the symptoms develop. Does areas where there's no leaves, does that, continue to be the case, or do those areas end up filling in?
Mm-hmm.
Or it may be a situation where you get enough new growth that you still have those blank areas, but it becomes much less apparent with time.
I
So
see.
it's something we still don't really know what's causing it. I think that there's definitely a genetic component because we're only seeing it in certain varieties, and there definitely seems to be some type of weather component because we're only seeing it in certain years. So, and then of course we're only seeing it in certain orchards. Even from the same nursery, Monterey planted in the same year in two orchards, and it's a problem in one orchard and not in the other. So, it's not just one cause. It appears to be really, really complicated, but also on the research front, I'm really excited about the work that Maciej Zwiniecki is doing at UC Davis with the Carbohydrate Observatory. And we see that Monterey tends to have fewer carbohydrates than some of the other varieties. So I'm hoping that growers will continue sending in samples to that observatory, and that gives us an answer with time as well.
Wow. Okay. Well, thanks, Luke, for following up in this topic and even trying to connect the dots there with carbohydrates and see if we can find an explanation to this and dedicating time to this and moving this the solution forward. It's definitely something that we appreciate. So thanks for that, Luke. And you mentioned a little bit about fruit set, and I want to move a little bit away of the leaf failure and highlight that fruit set in general for other varieties was really good this season, this 2020 crop season. And I was curious, what do you think were the main factors that explain this situation? I mean, how could you summarize or what are the key things that happened during this season that we got a great fruit set?
Yeah, so just very simply, and I'm biased by my setting here in the northern Sacramento Valley, but in 2019, it was so wet in February and at full bloom that Danny Lytle, the farm advisor in Glynn County at the time, she was doing bloom ratings at the variety trial at Chico State that we have, supported by the Almond Board, and she couldn't even access the field to tell bloom and really get a sense of bloom at nonpareil full bloom. And you contrast that with this year, where there were 0 inches of rainfall in February at the Durham Sema Station. So I think having a good population of flowers going into this year and then having perfect bloom weather is the answer.
Great. So it seems to be a combination of bloom density that it's coming up from the previous season management. So good management at the end plus good weather. So when that I think that's very nice to see when both things occur, good management and good weather, we can achieve great fruit set. Um, I would like to move to May because I want to do like a little bit of a sequence through the season. So we went from we talk a little bit about bloom now, and now I would like to move a little bit to spring and to summer. And as May, as the season progresses, irrigation management is always probably must have play a key role to obtain sustainable yields and good yields. So our trees have a big fruit set. And how did irrigation play a role to make sure that at the end of the season we had good yields, not only good fruit sets? So, in your view, what was particular this year with irrigation management? Did you receive any particular call or any unique about irrigation management during this crop season?
Sure. So I guess just to start with on the topic of maintaining good crop development and a good crop set year, it's critical to have good water management during that kernel fill stage. So this as the weather warms. And we didn't get, at least in the southern part of the San Joaquin Valley, we did not get a lot of rain between about December 20th until the middle of March, and then the rains picked up after that. So a lot of soil may not have adequately refilled to capacity like we would hope would happen during the dormant period. So with potentially less moisture reserves in the soil, we may be needing to pay attention earlier as to if the trees are needing, if the moisture in the ground is meeting the transpiration needs of the tree, especially during these important times when crop development is happening. We also, during the initial stages of hull split, often recommend deficit irrigation. And I think that some problems that I see some people run across is that they'll just maybe uniformly decide to dial back on the moisture during hull split to help with problems that may come from with hull rot and things like that we associate with too much moisture during that time. So some people may inadvertently stress the trees a little bit more than they should, because they're not enough attention to the texture of the soil that the crop is growing in. And so this is something important that needs to be taken into consideration. If you have a sandier textured soil, you have a lower water holding capacity. And so there's going to be a lot greater impact of potentially reducing your water during that hull split period by 25% than if you have a heavier clay loam type soil. So attention to your soil type, and then also using some tree water stress monitoring tools that are available to you to really gauge, is this level of stress in the target area, or am I doing this too much?
Oh, okay. Wow, that's very interesting. And you touch a little bit in um, um, water holding capacity, and I know you've been working on improving soil structure, more specifically soil percolation, water infiltration. Um, and all those problems start to show up as the season progresses. As if you have a poor soil structure, etc., it's really in the spring and summer when you start to see those bigger problems, probably. And what could you expand a little bit on that area? What you have been doing, or what you have observed as a common problem in California orchards with regards to water holding capacity or soil structure?
Sure. Okay. Well, I guess I'll first start with soil structure. So I think that sometimes problems with the structure of the soil, which can be an artifact of having soil textures with a higher silt content, is in particular a lot of times where we'll see structural problems that are driven by physical characteristics. Structural problems.
I don't know if it's sweet actually.
Sorry.
So I was just hearing some background
Can
noise.
you please mute the phone?
Okay.
I'm gonna mute.
So some structural problems can also come from chemical problems with the soil, where these tend to be areas where we have very saline sodic or sodic conditions, where sodium is a dominant salt that we have in the soil, and this can also cause some structural issues. So, but in some areas, and in particular, I'm thinking of some of the Tulare County areas that are maybe close to the Kings River, and we do actually have some trials in these areas where we would have assumed, maybe based on some problems with infiltration, that this was driven by a chemical problem. But on additional study and looking more closely at this, we just didn't find those common indicators that you would associate with poor infiltration from chemical reasons, as increased sodium amounts relative to the calcium and magnesium content in the soil. So we weren't seeing these high SAR, low EC conditions that we associate with poor infiltration. Some of the growers in this area, will apply maybe heavier gypsum applications without getting really satisfactory results. And so, in doing these investigations, you see, okay, some of these soils have actually a larger silt content. And when you have more silt, the soil particles that make up silt soils are much smaller and finer than what we see in more coarse textured soils, like sandy soils, where the particles actually have much larger size. And so when we have a lot of equipment, as we need, going through the orchard, frequent basis, year after year, on these silty textured soils, they're a little bit more sensitive to this type of management. And so over time, when that structure breaks up, those small particles can fill soil pores and create hard pan like conditions. And so we're interested to see how, if a lot of people are encountering these type of problems in their orchard, and looking into possible ways to alleviate that, particularly in mature orchards that are bearing. And so we're looking into some possibilities, like maybe ripping down the drip line, or using a combination of different amendments to try to help with infiltration and moving water down through the soil profile to reduce stress to the almond trees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, wow, that's a lot of information right there. Definitely, it's. I mean, I'm always impressed how soil conditions are quite unique to the particular site and to the management that may have occurred in that site through years. So definitely something to keep in mind. And yesterday, when you and I and Roger and others were talking in the irrigation work group, you brought up that the fact that we have many rootstocks for different situations, but we have to be careful that the rootstocks are not really a replacement for these problems. They help us to live with them, but still there seems to be a need to manage all these different soil challenges. Is that a good conclusion of yesterday's conversation as well?
Yeah. Yes. No, I definitely can think of examples where I've seen maybe a hybrid rootstock compared to a Nemagard, and with this is more of a chemical issue. So with high levels of bicarbonate in the soil, a lot of lime in the soil, and you will see a lot more signs of deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, if you have two blocks planted side by side. So rootstock can definitely play a role in working with some of these problems.
Yeah, they help, but even if the rootstock is salinity resistant or tolerant, I guess the message is that we should still try to control for salinity. Having a good rootstock doesn't solve the problem completely.
Right. Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, most trees are. I mean, any tree that's living in a low, in saturated conditions with low oxygen, it doesn't matter what the rootstock is. That's going to be problematic.
I see. I see. Well, thank you, Mae. I would like to move to Kat. You know, I would like to move to later in the season to summer, and what a summer! We have a very unique summer with even a very big, several, I would say, several heat waves. And you know, what do you think about those heat waves from a tree physiology point of view, Kat? And I ask you this because well, I think you're one of the best persons to ask about this. We are familiar with your PhD work, where you work with in tree physiology, trying to understand this, and we may not know a lot, but the little we know, it's probably there in your mind. So, what do you think about these heat waves? How, from a physiological perspective, I don't know, could you help us to connect the dots with these heat waves and what the tree is experiencing?
Yeah, what a summer, right? I mean, it's like, do I pay attention to the heat wave or to the fire that's about to burn my house down, or to help my friends evacuate, or like, yeah, make sure I get enough irrigation for these trees that are stressed? There were like, yeah. And then COVID, there was a lot to keep track of this summer. Well, I mean, I guess I would start with, one thing we know, that the process of buds being laid down for the following year is going on throughout the summer. So we have these sort of these two processes that are happening, that are coinciding. We're growing the crop and we're laying down the foundation for the crop the following year. And so that'll be interesting to see if this heat stress from last year had an impact on the crop that's to come. Because we know that leaf buds they start being laid down in the late spring, essentially, and that process happens through early summer. And then after harvest, some of those leaf buds then turn into flower buds. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other heat stress is just, it's when the trees are stressed for heat, especially when they don't get enough water as well, a lot of systems sort of shut down or go into a lower mode. So things like optimizing photosynthesis so that we can be capturing enough carbon to both grow our crop and have some storage for the year to come. It'll be interesting to see if these heat stress events had an impact on that. As Luke was saying, this is something that the Z Lab, the Carbohydrate Observatory, is spending a lot of time and energy looking at, and the more samples that they can get from people, the better we will understand that. Because the trees will regulate photosynthesis if they're not getting enough water to keep those stomata under the leaves open, and so that could mean less sugar in the future. Yeah, I think those are kind of a couple of things that I'm looking at and thinking about in terms of heat stress and during the summer.
I see. Okay, so from a kind of like theoretical point of view, or what we know from other studies is that the trees will actually, when it's too hot with this heat wave, they could close their stomata, produce less energy or less food for those buds that are being developed, and then we may play a little bit against for next year's bloom, but it remains to be seen. Is that a fair summary of one of the points you were saying there, Kat?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that throughout the growing season, the tree is trying to chug along to produce sugar for the crop that it's growing, but also to go into storage and get through winter. And so if there's less sugar going into winter in that storage, then we might have a weaker bloom the following year. So we'll see how that plays out.
Well, and if we keep in mind that it was a great fruit set, a great yield, so a lot of energy going into that fruit, and we still want some of that energy going into the buds that are being developed, and we keep in mind these heat waves, really it comes across as that the fall, like the management in September, October, that our growers could have made, or the management that are finalizing now, could also have a big impact in next year yield.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, right, given the heavy set this year and the extra stressors, it was like these trees running a marathon in a heat wave. As your PhD work showed, there's a lot of, we don't think of almonds as an alternate bearing crop because they're largely spur bearing, and so that the alternate bearing that happens is sort of in many little bits within the tree. The spurs themselves won't bear fruit 2 years in a row because they just get pretty exhausted. But then usually when you look at the whole picture of the tree, there's some spurs that are tagging in the year that the spur that was on before has to tag out. And so, but in a year like we just had, when it was a heavy crop, a fair number of stresses in terms of heat, but I think especially the heavy crop, we'll see if that means that there's fewer spurs, more spurs tagging out, not quite as many spurs tagging in next year, because we see that return bloom on a spur by spur basis is pretty low. You did that work, so you could rattle off those numbers better than I could, but I think it's something about, 10 to 20% of the spurs are bearing in any given year. And a lot of those spurs will actually die when they've set a heavy crop like we've had this year.
Yeah, I did
go ahead.
I did part of that work, but I think what you're bringing out is connecting the points here, and that's you well said. I mean, the trees were running a marathon with a heavy load, meaning that most of the trees have a lot of fruitiness spurs with a lot of fruit, and not many non-fruiting spur resting. And then it was this heavy heat wave, which was another stressor, as you point out. And so
so you don't want to like get to the end of running that marathon and then be like, all right, well, go run some more, or like, all right, well, I'm not going to give you any water or snacks to like rebound. So after a year like this, it really is important to make sure that after harvest, you give those trees a little love to rebound from that stress that they've just had, and what that means. I mean, especially we're thinking about water, so that those leaves can stay on, so that those leaves can keep producing sugars through September, October. We know that giving them lots of nitrogen is not part of that rebound, right? Because we don't want that nitrogen to leach out of the system. But more, I'm thinking in terms of making sure they have enough water to not stay stressed and to keep producing carbohydrates.
Yeah, definitely manage for this season as well as for the other season. While the fruiting spurs run this marathon for the current season, the growers also have the non-fruiting spurs there that are going to be in charge of running the following season.
Right. Yeah. Like I was a college athlete, so I always come up with sports metaphors. But it's like you want to have that deep bench, right? Like you don't just want like a good set of folks who are going to be able to play this year. If you've got your star players that get injured, you want a deep bench so that you can tag them in. And it's a similar thing with growing almonds. You want a deep bench of spurs so that you can have your star players really give this year, and then they can sit out and you can have more tag in the following year.
Yeah. So, if heat waves wasn't enough, following the heat waves we experienced, and you mentioned a little bit, multiple wildfires, and the fires brought an abundance of smoke, making it even more difficult to dry some late varieties on the ground. In some of the locations, we observed that. But so I don't know if you have any insights. Why would that be the case? And also perhaps from a tree physiology point of view, how smokes could play as an stressor if they play as an stressor.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question that we're looking more and more. I mean, I think a lot of folks are starting to research more the impact of smoke as it continues to be a pressure in California systems. It's wild that, I mean, up here we had a fire in June that I had people getting evacuated, I was like housing refugees from, and down in Fresno, I mean, the fire down there has been going, I mean, it seems like until very recently. So it's been smoke just throughout the growing season. But as you said, I think especially down south, that was really a problem around harvest for these later varieties. And what we know is that it's funny because there can be some good mitigating things about that smoke from a tree physiology perspective, inconveniences of that smoke, to say the least. So if you're not getting, I mean, it sort of acts like a fog, essentially. So it's the light that gets through is being diffused more and is not as intense. So that means that things were essentially, we're not getting as hot in these piles on the orchard floor, or as the nuts were scattered, so they weren't drying out as much. But it's also interesting that we talk about this in the walnut world, that some of the highest quality crop we have is when there's wildfires around harvest, because that mellowing of the intensity of the light is good for works well for the nuts, and for the leaves as well, because the photosynthetic apparatus works a little better when the light is a little more mellow and not that sort of intense July, August beating down on you sun. So so that's all to say that nuts would have had a hard time drying because the intensity of light that got through to them was not as great as we're accustomed to. But it may have been a little better for the trees themselves, because it's sort of a gentler light that, as they were stressed coming out of harvest, might have treated them with a more of a velvet glove as far as photosynthesis goes. Oh, you're frozen. I hope I'm not frozen. Ruh-roh.
You're not frozen, Kat.
Fine
Yeah.
to me. I think it's Sebastian's connection.
Oh, all right.
I am there.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, sorry for that. I was your audio was coming through. So, and I was, as I was listening to you, I was thinking this lack of direct sunlight and the fact that we observe that some varieties had some kernels on the floor had a harder time to get dry.
Yeah.
In a way, kind of confirms what Bruce Lampinen had been saying for a while. I think that he's been talking about leaving about 50%, 15%, 15% of light interception available to dry the almonds and retain food safety quality. So he's when he goes with the light bar across the valley, he talks about yield potential and says that you need to shoot for an 85% light interception. In other words, meaning that you have 15% of your open canopy, so the lights can penetrate and dry those almonds. And in a way, this kind of confirms that need, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, right. It definitely points to the value that we're getting every year from that sunlight beating down on those nuts and drying them out. The like solar oven that is happening up and down the valley in August and September on almond orchard floors. And that we do need to ensure, as you say, both ease of processing and food safety perspective, that we have enough open space down the middle of the row that sunlight can get through the canopy, that there's not overlapping of those canopies down the row, so that sunlight can get through to the orchard floor and heat those nuts up enough or heat the water on them enough that we can get evaporation out of those nuts. And I mean, I think it's sort of if the last 3 years are any indication, wildfires are not going away anytime soon in California. So this was a good year to start thinking about that and innovating around that, looking at options like conditioners for your windrows to just keep churning those nuts over and move some of that water through, redistribute some of that moisture through so that more of it comes up to the top so that it can evaporate out.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks for sharing those thoughts. I promised I was going to go during this webinar from the beginning of the season to throughout the season to the end of the season. I started with Luke talking a little bit about this leaf bud failure, with Mae about water management, irrigation management during the season, you talking about the heat waves. And I would like to now go back to Luke, because there was something else that happened at in late summer Luke, I think it was in late summer when you gave us a little bit the heads up about almond leaf scourge, this plant pathogen problem. Apparently a disease that is growing up in Europe that we have had here in the past, but perhaps never as severe as this year. And I know you've been following up also that leaf scourge outbreak.
Indeed.
Sorry. So
Yeah.
I think you even have a slide for that. Do you want me to share as well?
Sure. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Sebastian, I like this structure you have of going through the season. And indeed, this is a problem that shows up late in the season. The almond leaf scorch caused by a bacteria, Xylella fastidiosa, which is spread by leaf hoppers and other insect vectors. And it really shows up in July and August when the xylem plugging from this bacteria ends up causing this marginal necrosis or yellowing and then death on the edges of the leaf, and then that spreads inwards. And it's something that has been just a problem on and off for 70 years in California. It's been around a long time, but this was a year where things really seemed. I saw it in far more spots, and some other farm advisors did as well, and in places where I knew that it was on a few trees, like the almond variety trial at Chico State. Now it's on, I would say, possibly over half of the trees. So it exploded this year for some reason.
Wow. And do we know anything why this year versus not the other years? If you can expand on that, and are we doing any follow up in this area in terms of research that could help us to solve some of the unknowns?
Sure. I can really only speculate why we saw so much of it this year in certain spots. It is a problem that we associate with hotter conditions, having potentially more severe scorch, and then we also are concerned about warmer conditions in the winter. There's potentially some curative role if you have cold winters. It can reduce the population of the bacteria. So definitely something that we're worried about going forward, and something that Franz Niederholzer, myself, and a number of other farm advisors are working with Rodrigo Almeida at UC Berkeley on trying to research and first figure out what we're dealing with, because there's some thinking that we have a multiplex species in the Sacramento Valley and a fastidiosa subspecies in the San Joaquin Valley. And so again, similar to the leafing failure, I didn't hear a lot of reports in the southern San Joaquin Valley. So figuring out first what biology of this bacteria is where is going to be part of answering the question, as well as seeing what happens next year and whether this is kind of a one-off year, or whether the trees that have these symptoms now look worse next year.
Well, again, look, I really appreciate that you with the other farm advisors follow up with faculties like Rodrigo from Berkeley. I think he got a PhD in Brazil in Xylella fastidiosa, which is actually this agent that produces almond leaf scourge. So I think you guys are building a great team, and from field experience to lab experience to really learn more about this disease and hopefully know how to mitigate it. So thanks for following up on this one as well. That said, I have a question for the three of you, which is, if you wanted to comment or bring another point to the table here, to the conversation that we're having during this webinar, that you would like to share with our growers. There's anything that we haven't covered yet before I open it to the Q&A during the next 10 minutes or so?
I would just say on that subject of almond leaf scorch that we did have a few confirmed cases in Fresno County, and that was the first for me for actually seeing that in Fresno County this year.
I see. Okay. And in any variety in particular, or?
I'm sorry, I cannot remember right now,
Okay.
but I think it may have just have been probably nonpareil. I don't know. So.
And I am understanding correctly that the consequence of almond leaf scorch, it's pretty much what we see in the pictures, those leaves that get yellow and then connecting it with Kat was talking, producing an stressor for next year's bloom. Is that kind of like the connection between this disease and how it can reduce yield potential?
Indeed, and whether it gets worse in future years, whether there's more of these scorch symptoms across the canopy, and whether they potentially even show up earlier in the season. That's why there can be a significant yield reduction with almond leaf scorch, but it's not impacting this year. The question is what happens in the coming years.
I see. Any other comments from the speakers?
I would just say invest in bees. Like, make sure that you have really strong colonies going into this bloom. I think we just got really, really lucky with kind of perfect bloom conditions this past year, where even if you didn't do perfectly on having 2 to 3 colonies per acre, 6 to 12 frame hives, you may have gotten, kind of slid by if you didn't have the best practices with bees. But that's something I would pay attention to try to retain good yields going forward.
Yeah, I would sort of echo that too. We're going into a La Nina winter, which, if anyone could say for sure what's going to happen, they'd be making a lot of money. But Daniel Swain down at UCLA is projecting that it'll be a cold, dry winter. And so that those cold temperatures make the case for making sure that you have a solid bee situation in your orchard, because those bees just don't like to fly when it's not as warm. And it brings up something that Mae was saying earlier as well about making sure that you have a full profile of moisture in your soil as you go into bloom and as you go into the spring. And that might, I'm not saying definitely you'll need to irrigate, but that's something to keep an eye on if it does turn out to be a drier winter. And as we're looking towards, as you asked, like having a good fruit set this coming spring, that'll be a way, avoiding that water stress, both in terms of having too much and having not enough, will be a good way to try to keep as many of those fruits that set on the tree and mitigate that June drop that we have.
Yeah, no, and you guys are bringing an excellent point here, because if we backtrack with all these stressors that occur during the season, Luke was talking about leaf scorch at the beginning. Now, almond leaf scorch, bud failure. What is it called again? I keep confusing.
Leafing failure.
Leafing failure. Sorry, leafing failure as an stressor. Soil structure perhaps as a stressor in some orchards. Almond leaf scorch as an stressor, the heat waves as an stressor. Yield also could be seen as an stressor for the future, for the next season yield. So if we keep all those things in mind, really the next year's bloom could be a little bit, and it's really the management, as you guys are pointing out, that can help us to have, again, a good bloom density, and help those trees to, during bloom, to weed bees, etc., with a good integrated pest management approach, fungicides, etc., during that season, to secure fruit set again. It seems to be that the bar is a little bit high to do it the same as this season. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, I love these topics and I find it fascinating. So thanks a lot for sharing your expertise in this area. And